So I should probably begin by warning you that the subtitle of my project, An Adaptation of Plato's Laches, is a bit misleading, because although it started off with the intention of being a dramatic adaptation of a Socratic dialogue, the finished product isn't really anything like this at all. Ultimately, it turned out not to be an adaptation of the Laches, but more like an independent philosophical dialogue on the subject of philosophical dialogues, which takes the Laches as a starting point, but which almost immediately moves away from it as the dialogue begins. Ultimately, the project became an exploration through dialogue of the dialogue as a literary and philosophical form, a form which I argue is uniquely useful for developing, communicating, and understanding philosophical arguments in their entirety. But before I get into the specifics of what all that means, I want to set up some of the background ideas and assumptions in my project, starting with what a philosophical dialogue actually is. And in a sense, this is a really huge and complicated question, and it's exactly what my project is about, but it'll be useful to get a working definition of dialogue out there for the sake of the presentation. So at the most fundamental level, philosophical dialogue is a genre of philosophical writing which presents its arguments and questions as a mimesis or representation of conversation. The conversation takes place between several participants or interlocutors who are trying to answer some question or a series of questions about a specific, more or less obviously philosophical issue. This conversation takes place in some dramatic setting, usually a public space, which is more or less significant for setting up the question that the participants will discuss. For example, the interlocutors might be a group of friends attending a wedding who, after perusing the gift table, are inspired to inquire into the nature and conditions of generosity. So, in this way, with its interplay of character and setting among other elements, the dialogue is at once a dramatic and a literary form, as well as a philosophical one composed of arguments. So who writes dialogues? The name that probably most immediately comes to mind is Plato, who wrote his philosophical works almost exclusively in this form, tracing the life and thinking of his teacher Socrates throughout his body of work. It's widely agreed that Plato was the philosopher who both defined and perfected this genre, or more specifically the subgenre of Socratic dialogue. It was through Plato that the philosophical dialogue became more structured and more formalized in order to bear the weight of its philosophical arguments. And as Victoria Hosel has pointed out, employing elements of dramatic writing, Plato used the character of Socrates as a way of modeling a method for moral and philosophical education through conversation and an examination of one's awareness of her own knowledge. After Plato, the dialogue remained more or less influential throughout the history of philosophy, at least until the 19th century, when it went through a sort of period of decline which lasted not without some noteworthy exceptions into the 20th century. And while it would definitely be an overstatement to claim that the dialogue is an extremely rare form for philosophy to take today, I think it is safe to say that the dialogue is out of fashion, or at least very uncommon in most professional philosophical circles. Although there are notable exceptions, such as the dialogues of Iris Murdoch, much philosophical writing has turned toward the form of the treatise, the book, or academic journal article to express their arguments, relegating the dialogue to somewhat of an oddity. And what I think this shows is that most contemporary philosophical works are not often written with the intention of being literary works, and they're rarely seriously interpreted as such. That being said, based on the volumes of books, articles, and even dialogues devoted to the subject of dialogue, it's clear that the value of the dialogue form has not been entirely forgotten. Which brings me to the central question underlying this project, which is why anyone would bother to write a philosophical dialogue in the first place. What does the form of dialogue, a representation of a fictional conversation between characters, add to our understanding of philosophical arguments contained in a philosophical work, if anything? What makes it a valuable form for philosophy to take? It's often claimed that the value of dialogue lies in its close relationship to real-life conversation, that dialogue imitates real philosophical discussions or provides a model for how conversation should take place. While this seems true to a certain extent, in my own dialogue I emphasize two other, not entirely unheard of, suggestions to this question. The first is that the dialogue is able to handle uncertainty in the philosophical positions of both the character and the author. It's not uncommon in dialogues, especially those written by Plato, for the conversation to end not with a conclusive answer to the question guiding the dialogue, but in a state of confusion or bewilderment, often called aporia. The characters leave their conversation having realized that what they thought they knew is not the case, without necessarily solving the problem they initially raised. In the Laches, for example, which concerns the definition of courage, the characters do not ever formulate a satisfactory definition of courage. The dialogue actually ends quite abruptly, with little definitive progress made on the issue of courage, and with the characters promising to meet again to talk with Socrates on this topic. And what this means is that the dialogue is a starting point for philosophical inquiry, a promise of further examination, not just on the part of the characters, but also on that of the author. The author need not take a definitive position in the dialogue, because it is not her voice which expresses the arguments. She is free to explore all avenues of an issue by taking a more distant position on the subject she is examining. And this gives rise to the second feature of dialogue which I explore in my project, which is the fact that through the development of characters and dramatic setting, the dialogue is able to give flesh and blood to different positions surrounding a topic. The people who argue in a dialogue are not disembodied arguments for or against a single position, but fictional characters with commitments, feelings, and who experience reactions that are much like those of real individuals who might find themselves discussing these topics in their ordinary lives. The dialogue not only forces the author to remain open to many different points of view, thus holistically examining her question, but it also forces her to remember that a philosophical position cannot be divorced from the commitments, biases, and motivations of the person arguing for it. The dialogue reminds us that no one will ever present a philosophical argument to another abstract mind, but rather to another person who has her own thoughts and opinions. Furthermore, the literary and dramatic aspects of the dialogue require both author and audience to recognize that there is always something at stake in the answering of the proposed question, always some reason to continue the inquiry into a certain subject. So now that I've outlined some of the general assertions and work in my dialogue, I want to spend the second half of my presentation talking a bit more about the specifics of the dialogue I wrote as a way of answering the questions I've outlined. As I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, I originally began this project with the intention of its being a dramatic adaptation of one of Plato's dialogues, the Laches. Initially, I wanted to see how the philosophical arguments in the dialogues would hold up in a new dramatic setting, one which is updated for a modern audience and which could use the emotional impact of a dramatic narrative to communicate philosophical ideas. The original Laches is a dialogue about courage, which takes place in the Athenaeum Gymnasium, where men are practicing hand-to-hand combat. Two fathers, Lysimachus and Melesius, bring two famous generals, Laches and Nicias, to the gymnasium to ask these men whether or not they should send their sons for this type of training, because they want their sons to grow up to be famous and well-respected members of Athenian society. They then invite Socrates, who's conveniently hanging around the area, to join in their conversation, and from there they enter into a discussion about moral education and the proper virtues to instill in children, which leads them to inquire into the nature of courage. And so part of the challenge for me was finding the correct dramatic setting in which to put my characters in a position to talk about courage in the present day. And since I would think it would be unusual for parents to send their children for this type of war training. So what I decided to do was set my dialogue on a soccer field, where a group of parents are sitting on the sidelines preparing post-practice snacks for their children. One of the parents, Tina, who is the analog to the Lysimachus character, is conflicted about why she is sending her child to soccer practice. She isn't sure that she's doing the right thing for him, so she asks two of the veteran parents, Linda and Nico, the not so cleverly renamed Laches and Nicias characters, for advice. And as they begin to give their opinions, they invite Sybil, or Socrates, the assistant coach, into the conversation, and the dialogue proceeds from there. But when I actually started writing the dialogue, I found that the whole thing seemed really forced, and I realized that Plato had already written this dialogue, so I really wasn't adding anything new to the conversation by adapting it in the way that I was. I came to the conclusion that what I was actually interested in was the dialogue as a genre and its form, and not the arguments of this particular dialogue. So at the suggestion of my advisor, I decided to have my characters break up their conversation, becoming suddenly conscious that they're in the dialogue, and shift the conversation to dialogue itself, investigating what a dialogue is and why, as I've already said, it's a viable form for philosophy to take. So the beginning of the dialogue, which parallels Plato's dialogue, establishes the characters, and the second part breaks off into a discussion of dialogue amongst those same characters. And here I develop the ideas I've outlined previously concerning the dialogue as both a way of exploring multiple conflicting views and viewing philosophical positions in light of the individuals who hold them. And like the characters in the Laches itself, I didn't come to any clear conclusions about dialogue or philosophy or art more generally in the writing of this dialogue. If I came to any certain conclusions, it's first that I'm not very good at writing dialogues, and second that dialogue is definitely a humbling form for philosophy to take, and I think we should see more of it in the academy and beyond. What writing this dialogue enabled me to do was to get clearer about the questions I want to ask about what we're doing when we engage in inquiry and what form that inquiry can take. Thank you. Yeah.
So what's the difference between, so can a dialogue have like be in like a film, or is it usually only on paper? And my follow-up question is, what's the difference between a dialogue and a movie or like a film that's contained in like a closed setting, and the emphasis? Like, is 12 Angry Jurors like a dialogue, or is that more of like a film and just kind of parsing out the differences?
Yeah, so the question is whether or not a dialogue can be film, right, basically. Yeah. Was there a second part to the question? No. Okay, cool. Yeah, but to answer your question, 12 Angry Jurors, is that what it was, right?
Yeah.
Like, totally, that's totally a dialogue. I don't think it's, I mean, traditionally they're written, right? And I think philosophical dialogues, for sure, kind of tend to take a written form. But, you know, My Dinner with Andre can be considered a dialogue, perhaps. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be translated into film. Yeah.
Could you argue that, in a way, the dialogue has been subsumed? So when you read moral philosophy, for example, sometimes people will say, okay, so here is the problem. It might be objected that, so that at some level there's a way in which one voice is privileged over the other, but there's still some kind of give and take that the author, him or herself, is putting out there, so that there's I don't know, let's say, I'm not sure it's a dialogue, but do you think that that's the residue of what you're talking about? That it hasn't been entirely banished? And I agree with you, especially when it comes to analytical philosophy, that what language can do and what it can't, and the fictional metaphoric aspects and the way in which argument and logic don't always converge. That's still in there somehow, isn't it?
Of course, yeah, and that's something I definitely considered. Of course that, you know, people are considering different opinions in their sort of first-person philosophy and moral philosophy, as you're talking about. But what I think is lost, and what I tried to emphasize, is this idea that there are other people supporting these, supporting these opposite or conflicting arguments or positions, right? There are people who have other commitments and motivations behind those arguments, so it's not just this sort of disembodied objection. And that's, I think, what the dialogue provides that not a treatise or a journal article won't necessarily offer or provide. Does that answer the question? Okay. Okay, great, thank you.